What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a build for Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, specifically for the Kinetic Sharpshooter, a recently added archetype via a DLC, A Dance of Masks. And I knew right away when I saw this archetype being added that I wanted to do something for it because I could tell just by looking at it that it was going to be quite strong. And that's because, unlike a regular Kineticist, the Kinetic Sharpshooter uses a bow and gets the bonuses from attack and damage rolls from that bow added to their kinetic blasts, and given how strong kineticists already are, giving them those bonuses is already quite overpowered. Now the trade-off there is that they lose access to some of their infusions, which can make them a little bit of a late bloomer. I would say I wasn't really hitting my stride with this until like level 15 in comparison to other kineticists. Now that said, it's still a kineticist, so if you know what you're doing, you'll be critting for over 100 before you even leave Act 1. With that little overview out of the way, it is important that I mention that this particular build video kind of assumes that you understand how a kineticist works, because otherwise I'd have to spend about another 40 minutes added to this video to explain it. But the good news there is I've already made a video exactly like that, so I'll try to link that down in the description below if you would like to learn about how to play a kineticist, as they are, simply put, a bit different mechanically than basically everything else. Now with that out of the way, let's start talking a little bit about what makes the Kinetic Sharpshooter unique besides just their weapon, and it really comes down to two things. Their Kinetic Quiver ability at level 3, which replaces their Gather Power ability that every other kineticist will use. So Kinetic Quiver allows you to spend a single point of burn, our kineticist's resource pool, that as they add to it, reduces their max health, to effectively forego having to use Gather Power. That's important because that means that we don't have to spend time using Gather Power and can simply attack every round, so long as we have ammunition in our Kinetic Quiver. This is going to allow us to do things such as effectively use our Quicken Metakinesis, which is kind of like meta magic for Kinetic Blast that will allow us to make more than one blast in a turn, while also activating just tons of infusions and things to really provide a ton of burst. Now the downside to this is that once you've burnt through your Kinetic Quiver, you become a bit less effective, as you will no longer be able to pay the burn cost associated with using all of that power to begin with. Now you can reactivate Kinetic Quiver in combat, but this will cost you an action, meaning that you basically won't be able to do anything else that turn, provided you aren't already at your max burn anyway, which will prevent you from doing more ludicrous combos anyway. So the nuance to playing this specific class is that it is simultaneously easier than most other kineticists, but also requires a little bit more micromanagement of your individual blasts to make sure you know what you're doing when. And if you don't mind doing that, it's extremely effective, primarily because you're going to have a pretty insane chance to hit due to getting those extra bonuses from the weapon that a kineticist would not normally receive. Now from here, we're going to walk through everything there is to know about building this character before talking about gear and some general combat advice. But naturally, let's start at character creation. So right away, picking which race to play as, pretty much as usual, I would recommend playing a human so we can very quickly pay the upfront feat cost to make things easier. You don't need to play a human to do this, but the human's extra feat at character creation makes them undefeated in terms of quickly getting certain builds up to par. If you don't want to play a human, basically anything that's going to give you a bonus to dexterity or constitution will work perfectly fine. But then next up, we need to pick our background. Now, as a class and a build that does not utilize much equipment in terms of proficiencies or anything like that, our background is not super important, because there's nothing we would like to inherit from a background that is mandatory to get us where we're going. So with that in mind, my usual default for a kineticist, in this case, is the River Kingdom's Daredevil. This is because we already have mobility as a class skill, which means we get a little bonus to it for picking this, and the other secondary effect of a +2 bonus to AC against attacks of opportunity is universally useful, which is more than can be said for basically all of the other backgrounds. Next up, we have our ability scores though. We're pretty much going to dump everything into dexterity and constitution, no surprise there. Personally, I like to take charisma down to 8 so I can round out dex and constitution at a nice 18 each, because we're not really using charisma for anything, and taking a hit to anything else can be detrimental to your overall character. Because things like wisdom, for instance, influence your will saves, and then reducing strength actually reduces your carry weight, which can cause some problems. That simply isn't worth it. But then we have our skills. Now, mobility is a big one here. That's probably what you're going to have the biggest bonus to. And then your other class skills that you could put points into are perception, persuasion, use magic device, or stealth. Now, personally, I like to go mobility, perception, and persuasion because even with our low charisma, this is a class skill, so we'll get a nice enough bonus to it. But the main one I would say is just to pump up mobility, as that's probably the most useful skill this particular character will be using. Stealth is unfortunately not very useful in this particular game, so while you can put points into it and even use it to potentially avoid random encounters on the world map, it doesn't have much utility besides. But mobility and perception are the big ones. Anything after that is kind of dealer's choice. But then we have our feats. We're going to pick 2 feats at character creation, and we want point blank shot and precise shot. Now, while we are actually using a bow, even if we weren't using a bow, we would want these 2 because they're going to help us hit things in range, which applies to any sort of ranged attack. In the case of ours, either a simple ranged attack for our physical blasts or a ranged touch attack for our energy blasts. Worth a mention, though, that while we are using a bow, we're not really going to be picking up any other ranged weapon talents, because all of the other ones very specifically mention that they are for ranged weapon attacks that actually require you to utilize the bow in its intended manner, which we're not doing. After this, we're going to pick an element from air, earth, fire, or water. Now, I personally am going to go air here. Fire usually has a bit better damage overall, thanks to some of its wild talents. And water, I think, has a really great defensive feature called Shroud of Water. But air also has a pretty good one with Enveloping Winds. But truth be told, the actual type of damage we're dealing here doesn't make a ton of difference, so think more about what defensive feature you'd like more so than the individual energy type, because we're going to deal a little bit of reduced damage through Act 1 simply because of the nature of our class. But in any event, I picked air, and then we picked the type of blast we want to use that is associated with air, which is either a physical blast or an energy blast. I would recommend picking up the physical blast at least through Act 1, because until we pick up Ascendant Element as part of our mythic path, the energy blast will deal reduced damage, because all demons have some measure of resistance to these things. And you'll have a little more luck with the physical blast in terms of damage. However, if you would like to pick the energy blast first, that's going to allow you to do touch attacks, which will make it a little easier to hit the enemy, but you'll deal reduced damage. So it's a bit of a trade-off, no perfect answer there, but personally I usually go with the physical one. And then you pick your deity, and that pretty much wraps it up for character creation. But unsurprisingly, we're not done quite yet, because then we have to level our character up, of course. So let's talk feats and then some of the Kineticist specific upgrades. Now, the nice thing is, right around, I would say, level 10 or 11, we're pretty much going to have what we need feat-wise. Everything after that's kind of dealer's choice. But to get into it, at level 3 and 5, I personally like to take Spell Penetration and Greater Spell Penetration. This is because your energy blasts are affected by enemies' spell resistance, meaning that you need to overcome that to actually hit them with an energy blast, which is another reason I prefer the physical over energy blasts in Act 1. So we need to pick up these to make sure that we're actually hitting enemies with our energy blasts later. Now at level 7, I like to pick up Blind Fight. This is just a very generally useful talent, especially for any high dexterity character, because it makes sure that if we get attacked by an invisible character, we don't lose our dexterity to armor class. And what's more, if we miss an enemy because of concealment, we can actually re-roll the mischance one more time to try to hit. So just a very generally useful feat that I usually give most everybody. But then at level 9, we can pick up Weapon Focus. Now you can pick up Weapon Focus either for the longbow or the kinetic blast in this case. It won't make much of a difference because we get the bonus from our bow or our kinetic blast, meaning that no matter what we choose there in terms of those two options, we'll get the same bonus to our attack rolls with that particular type, making us just, again, more generally likely to hit the enemy. Because with Kineticists, it's really all about hitting them with extremely strong attacks, so the potential for missing an attack is unacceptably large. So you want to do as much as you can to mitigate that, which already the Kinetic Sharpshooter has a bunch of help with simply by getting those bonuses from the bow. So we can take that a little bit farther with feats like Weapon Focus. And then at level 11, we can pick up Air's Reach, which will double the effective range of any blast that uses air. Now, this might seem like a superfluous feat at first, but because the kinetic sharpshooter is what we're using, we actually need this. So one of the drawbacks of the sharpshooter is that they get a relatively low infusion count compared to other kineticists, and one of the most popular early infusions to get is extended range. This is because that's actually useful for extending the range, of course, but also because it's a required infusion for later. Thing is, though, kinetic sharpshooters cannot get that, which locks off some of their infusions from them, such as Deadly Earth, which is always popular. Air's Reach will at least allow us to make up for a little bit of that by giving us some of our range back. And then at level 13, I like to pick up Critical Focus, which is going to make us more likely to confirm critical hits. After that, at 15, I like to pick up Flaying Critical. When we do critical something, it receives a penalty to their natural armor AC for the duration of combat. And we're going to take some other stuff later to try to make us crit more often. Such as, at level 17, picking up Improved Critical for our Kinetic Blast. What we are actually attacking with is a kinetic blast at the end of the day, and so we're using the threat range for our kinetic blast and not our bow, so that's what we need. Now, honestly, your last feat at level 19 isn't going to matter much. You're going to have everything you need at this point, so that is largely up to you. Which brings us to our wild talents. Now, kineticists, based on the elements they've chosen, get some extra talents or little skills that they can pick up, which can allow them to take extra feats and things from a small list, alongside a few other neat abilities. So these options are generally a little on the limited side, but can still be fairly useful. But keep in mind, some of these look a little odd because there was no other choice, basically. So right away, you can pick up a familiar if you want. I like to pick up the Lizard for its bonus to natural armor AC and bonus to perception as well. At level 4, you can pick up the Dodge feat, giving yourself a little extra AC again. At 6, you can pick up Combat Mobility to give you extra dodge bonus to armor class against attacks of opportunity. And then at level 8, I picked up Kinetic Restoration. This allows you to heal things like ability score damage with your burn instead of having to use a spell or a scroll, which is just kind of a bit of utility for us. And then after that, I picked up 2 Lightning Reflex feats, basically to increase our reflex saving throw, which for a kineticist is already quite high. You can see it's a plus 36 there for this particular character, which is pretty solid for an unbuffed character. And then everything after that was just very generic stuff to pump up mobility and take on the defensive feature from our secondary element. But from there, let's talk infusions. As I mentioned, sharpshooters have very few infusions, but you'll pick your first one at level 3, and you'll have almost 0 options here, so I went with Exploding Arrows. This is going to allow our kinetic blast to do a bit of splash damage to any enemy within 5 feet of the original target. However, you do have to be careful about hitting your own allies with this, but if you can get a clustered up group of enemies that your allies are not next to, you can potentially eke out some extra damage with this one, but it's likely something you're going to be toggling on and off. Now at level 5, I picked up Spindle. Again, very limited options at the moment, and this is just like a general piercing ray basically that you can use that is useful very situationally. Now we don't get another infusion until level 9, and in my case I picked up Cyclone. But if you are running double air for your expanded element, that is to say at level 7, when you got a secondary choice of element, I picked air again so I could grab my energy blast for it. That gave me options in terms of infusions for either Cyclone or Magnetic. Now, I picked Cyclone for the AoE damage, but if you're playing on a higher difficulty, you'll probably want to pick up Magnetic Infusion there, and that is simply because Magnetic Infusion will give an enemy a pretty big debuff to their AC, -4, against enemies using metal weapons, that is to say our allies, and debuffing the enemy as well as buffing yourself is a big part of the higher difficulties. So that one is a little interchangeable, which is why I wanted to mention it. But at level 11 is where we start getting our really interesting infusions finally, the stuff that is specific to the sharpshooter. Starting with Rending Arrows. If we apply this infusion to our blasts, when we hit an enemy, we'll actually give it a -2 to their AC. We can stack this up to a -10. So basically, we can use our higher chance to hit to reduce enemy AC to make it easier for our allies to hit them. And it's possible later via a mythic feat to double that up and use Rending Arrows at the same time as another infusion, such as Honed Infusion. Honed Infusion completely allows you to ignore damage reduction, and while we're obviously going to be getting around things like the resistance to elements via the Ascendant Element mythic ability, this Honed Infusion is actually useful for bypassing the rest of an enemy's resistance or damage reduction from basically any other source, so can be quite useful. But then the single most important one, which is not available until level 17, is our Chain Arrows. This is when this build goes from pretty good to exceptional. Now the only catch here is that you cannot use this with the blast infused by anything else. Otherwise, when you activate this and hit an enemy, your blast will jump to another enemy within 10 feet until it runs out of enemies to hit, or you've reached the limit, which by the time you pick this up will be at least 8 enemies. Now, the secondary targets, the ones you did not actually aim at, only take half damage, but because a level 17 Kineticist will be dealing easily hundreds of damage per hit here, you're still looking at hitting the secondary enemies for about 150 to 200 apiece. Now, the only other thing I would mention to know about this is that every single enemy you hit has to have their own attack roll. That is to say, you will roll to hit for every enemy this attempts to hit, which is where some of our attack bonuses from our bows come in. Now, you're going to get one more infusion at level 19. Doesn't really matter what you pick. We've already got the important stuff. So whichever one you want. Now, next up, before we start moving on to gear and combat, I want to talk about mythic paths. So with this particular build, I would recommend either Azada or the Lich. Now, Azada is just a generally useful mythic path that, thanks to Aivu and a lot of your buff spells and buff abilities that you'll get as an Azada, makes you an incredibly valuable team member and great all around as a result. That said, if you want pure damage, you probably want to go Lich, and this is because the Azada Zippy Magic ability no longer affects Kinetic Blast like it used to, which used to be the single strongest thing a Kineticist could do mythic path-wise, but these days, if you're going Azada, basically all you're going to get is these superpowers, which are very strong on their own and can still be very useful, but don't do much for us damage-wise. But let's say you want to deal maximum damage. Well, in that case, you want the Lich Mythic Path for exactly one ability, and that is Negative Energy Mastery. Right at level 3, you could pick a Lich power that effectively allows you to add 1d6 negative energy damage to your Kinetic Blast right away, which increases with your mythic ranks, while also inflicting negative levels on the enemy if they're not immune to it. So if you just want absolute min-max stuff, then you want Lich. Now the catch to this is when the Lich hits their transformation at rank 8, you might want to retrain your character if you have the ability to, thanks to your difficulty, because once you fully turn into a Lich, your constitution will drop down to 0 basically, and your burn mechanic will be shifted over to charisma instead, at which point you might want to rethink your stat spread a little bit, which can be a tiny bit annoying. Now those are the two I would recommend, but I mean realistically you could play the other ones. Aeon is decently useful with its Enforcing Gaze that you can use to do things like debuff enemies in specific ways. Angels get their Halo, which affects your entire party, which could be useful, and of course their own spellbook. But for my money, I would pick either Azada or Lich. But with that exact thing in mind, let's actually talk about some of our feats and abilities we should be picking up as we level up our mythic path regardless. So right away at rank 1, we want to pick up whatever Ascendant Element corresponds to our Energy Blast, which should be right around the time that you actually pick up your Energy Blast anyway, because this will be level 7 when you get that secondary pick, or right around there at least. So right away, Ascendant Element for whatever you're using, and then at rank 2, I picked up Kinetic Overcharge. So while we don't actually use Gather Power, our Kinetic Quiver is still acting as Gather Power, which reduces it, which is exactly how the Kineticist Supercharge ability, which is also available to the Kinetic Sharpshooter, works. So basically this will simply allow our Kinetic Quiver to reduce or absorb more burn before we have to activate it again. At rank 3, I like to pick up Last Stand as a bit of a personal choice just because it makes our glass cannon slightly more tanky if things get out of control. And then at rank 4, I pick up Weapon Focus Mythic for the longbow. This is going to again make it easy for us to hit things, which is important on any difficulty. Now at rank 5, we get a really interesting one because at this point we can pick up Over-Infused Blast if you didn't already get it at rank 3 instead of Last Stand. But this allows us to apply 2 substance infusions at the same time. Now it's important to remember you cannot infuse anything else with chain arrows or it won't work, but this will allow you to apply both Honed Infusion and Rending or something like that at the same time to both debuff AC as well as bypass damage reduction as an example. And then at rank 6, I picked up Improved Critical for our Kinetic Blast as well. This increases the multiplier for our Kinetic Blast criticals. Now everything after that from roughly rank 7 or so is just superfluous. We have what we need at this point, so it's really just dealer's choice, whatever you're feeling especially inclined to mess around with, which is important to mention specifically because at that point, mythic ability wise, there's really not too much more that's specific to a kineticist. So it really is more about whatever just makes it easier or funner to play for you, such as using them to simply gather up more mythic feats to make it easier to hit things for example, etc. And with that out of the way, let's talk combat finally. So I want to show a few different examples from across the game, mostly early and then a little more mid to late game. So right away in the early game, this plays mostly like a standard kineticist because at this level you wouldn't have a lot of options anyway, so you'll basically just be able to, at level 3, use Kinetic Quiver instead of Kinetic Blast, instead of Gather Power. Now that doesn't mean we're weak, however, because kineticists deal a ton of damage, so by the time we even get to the end of Act 1, we should be dealing well over 100 damage, especially with a critical. So at that point, while you'll be using Kinetic Quiver, because all of your blasts are pretty basic, you won't really have to manage it very much, because your burn costs for your blast will basically be 0 anyway. Now what makes it a little more challenging is when you get a bit farther into the game and need to start managing all of your infusions, your blasts, your metakinesis, all of that stuff, and that's where the Kinetic Quiver really shines. But because we're using chain arrows, while if we critical will very seriously damage something, what we ideally want to do is group enemies up as much as possible and then hit them with chain arrows in the late game to hit just a ton of enemies back to back, dealing orders of magnitude more damage across multiple enemies. So while our single target damage will be nothing to thumb your nose at, as even just a random critical here can still do like 600, 700 damage before you're even in the late game getting the best gear, like your kinetic diadems or kinetic rods to increase your blast damage. But I think these numbers are more reasonable to what you would expect in kind of the middle chunk of the game rather than the very end of it, which is where I like to show combat at. But to be a little more specific, if you can group enemies up and activate all of your metakinesis alongside chained arrows, you can set up some truly massive attacks, even just right in like Act 4. So we can see here where I've got a bunch of enemies grouped up and I hit about 7 of them in a row for roughly 1300 damage. But the catch is, because I have all my metakinesis activated despite that massive hit, I'm actually not even done because I still have my move action, and thanks to metakinesis quicken, I can actually take another blast before my turn is done, which is what allows me to take this second attack here, adding about another 300 non-critical damage to the mix. But speaking of non-critical, it's worth a mention that because I'm rolling an attack for every single one of those bounces of chained arrows, every single one of those attacks has the potential to critically hit as well, which I thought was kind of neat when I was going over the numbers for this. So combat-wise, this is honestly a bit simpler than a normal kineticist, with the catch being that you need to manage all of your toggles for metakinesis as well as your infusions, and make sure that when your Kinetic Quiver runs out, that you're reactivating it. Now this is probably the one pain point of this specific build that I have, is that when you activate Kinetic Quiver, it does not actually tell you how much burn you can mitigate anywhere, other than simply looking at your blasts like you would normally. Meaning that it can be easy to, in the heat of battle and managing all of these other characters, forget to manage the burn of that one specific character, and next thing you know, they've maxed out their burn because you weren't looking at it, which can be slightly annoying. I do wish they had a more effective way to count the charges left in your quiver, but otherwise, it's relatively easy to play and it's extremely high damage, just like every other kineticist. But we're not quite done yet. I want to end this video talking about gear, which you may have noticed I left out up to this point, and that is because because kineticists don't rely a ton on gear. Ironically, the kinetic sharpshooter probably needs more gear than any other one simply because they have to actually equip a bow. So gear-wise, most of it is pretty obvious. Anything that increases your dexterity or your constitution is particularly useful, and beyond that, anything that will pump up your AC, because as always, kineticists are a bit of a glass cannon, and while you can get them a pretty solid AC provided you are stacking dexterity and using light armor that doesn't even have a maximum dexterity to AC bonus like a Haramaki, which I may or may not have pronounced correctly, I have no idea. And that combined with buffs can still get you to a pretty good place, but just be aware that you're kind of a squishy character in comparison to others. But most of that is pretty self-explanatory. Buff up your main ability scores while at the same time buffing up your AC. That's true for basically every character. And there are no specific pieces of equipment to really point out there. However, for kineticists, there are two bits of equipment that you want to pay special attention to, and these are kinetic diadems and kinetic rods. These are going to directly increase the damage of your blasts. You can get a kinetic diadem, a lesser one, right in Act 1 at an optional location if you talk to Anivia and the bartender at Defender's Heart to unlock some optional locations. In Act 3, you can get a lesser kineticist's rod at the tower you fight the dragon at with the storyteller. And while those are nice, you can get better versions. Starting in Act 3 and then later in Act 5, you can run into a skeletal merchant as a random event as you're moving around the world map, and this particular character has the potential to carry better versions of both the kinetic diadem and the kinetic rod up to the greater versions. And if you can get the greater versions of both, that's tremendous. They add a lot of damage to your blasts. Now beyond that though, we also need to worry about our bow here. But it's important to remember that the only thing we're keeping from the bow that we're using for our kinetic blasts are attack roll bonuses and damage roll bonuses. So all the other stuff on a bow is irrelevant. We don't care how much the damage from the bow actually is because we're not getting the bow's damage, we're getting its bonuses, which means that enhancement bonus that most items will have. So in this case, Finian here is a +3, which means I get that +3 to attack and damage rolls. But while we don't care about the base damage of the weapon, from what I can tell looking at the math on the kinetic blast rolls from these, you do actually still get anything that mentions extra damage from enchantments, so to speak. So in this case, Finian gets that 1d6 force damage. That gets added to our kinetic blasts. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, the only gripe I have about this in particular is that so much of our party is naturally archers that you're likely going to be using Finian most of the time, if only to save the other bows that you actually need the effects for your characters that will actually be using them for the effects, as opposed to simply their stats. So that's something to keep in mind. But equipment-wise, as always, kineticists are relatively tame in that regard, which is one of the reasons I enjoy playing them so much. But basically, buff up your AC, your dexterity and constitution, and otherwise simply look out for anything providing bonuses to chance to hit via your attack or damage rolls. But with that, I think we've just about wrapped this particular build video up. I certainly hope you enjoyed it, hope you found it fun. I've been having a ton of fun with it, and while, if I'm being honest, I think other kinetic archetypes still outstripe this one, something has to be said for the ease of use that this particular archetype utilizes while still being able to deal massive damage, with generally a better chance to hit while they're at it. But either way, that's pretty much going to do it for this particular video. I certainly hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, let me know down in the comment section below what you think about all this, which naturally means to like, comment, and subscribe. But regardless of all that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.